In addition to be the state senator, I've been flying airplanes in this area for 40 years around where this nuclear power plant is. Started an airline that now operates 93 airplanes. I've also been a licensed mechanic for the last 35 years. So I just want to put that as a perspective overlay, because when we have the Q&A, I think that offers an interesting perspective as well. So I'm going to race through these because a lot of what I have is going to be supporting and in addition to what you've heard from my colleagues here. The decommissioning goals, from a state perspective, from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. First and foremost, obviously, safe removal of fuel from the reactor vessel. The transfer fuel from the spent fuel to dry cask, I cannot emphasize that enough. From a pilot perspective, from a mechanic perspective, I think that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission way underestimates the difference between wet storage and dry storage. And if I emphasize anything here today, I think it is regulations that expedite the transition of fuel storage from wet to dry. Cleaning up the site, obviously, and making it productively used, consistent with community goals, local community goals. Give the public, state, and local authorities a real voice in the public process. Continue appropriate monitoring, emergency preparedness, and evacuation planning during the process. Obviously, that will be stepped up and stepped down as the process occurs and as the safety and the security issues change. Ensure that the economics of decommissioning reflect best public policy. And economics, you're going to see, I'm going to return to that as a very important part of this. Suggested regulatory approach, 2 slides forward, please. Thanks. One more. Next slide. Okay, thanks. Suggested regulatory approach for decommissioning. We would like to see that the licensee be required to prepare a more detailed, site-specific post-shutdown decommissioning activities report that includes site characterization, plans for site remediation, and a description of the end use of the site, plans for spent fuel management, proposed timeline for the decommissioning activities, safety and emergency preparedness plans that reflect the site-specific risks at various stages of decommissioning. The reason I keep going back to site-specific is if you look at the Pilgrim Nuclear Plant and you look at the district that I represent, it's very unique in the geography there. So all of our citizens have very different challenges getting away from that plant in the event of an event. And cost estimates for decommissioning and spent fuel management. Next slide, please. Suggested regulatory approach for decommissioning. Require the formation of a community engagement and advisory panel. I think you're hearing that consistently, that it's very important that state and local communities have real voice and real input. Require public hearings, opportunities to comment, etc. Require the NRC to analyze long-term environmental impacts of the shutdown plan prior to approval. I think there's a lot of focus on the short term, but I think there also need to be an understanding and included in the approval of the process what the long-term impacts are. Require local and state approval and NRC approval of the final PSDAR, and any request to change or update it going forward. So there's the approval initially, but then any changes also need local input, and we think there should be a process to facilitate that. Next slide, please. Suggested changes to the decommissioning trust funds. We think that there should be a real look at what the monies that have been put into trust ultimately can be used for. So we think there should be a broadening of the definition of legitimate decommissioning activities to include site restoration and spent fuel management. We think that these funds should be used to expeditiously and quickly move the fuel from wet storage to dry storage. And we should make sure that the funds are prioritized in that way. And we should not allow the funds to be used for corporate interests. And I think that would be a very dangerous precedent if we allowed that to happen. Next slide, please. Suggested changes to the decommissioning trust funds. To the extent possible, ensure that the parent company of the LLC that manages a singular station be held accountable for the cleanup costs. We are very concerned that corporate structure here is creating a veil or isolating or insulating the corporate interest at the top from site-specific liability, and we think that really needs to be looked at to the extent that it can. Clarify that non-radiological issues and issues unrelated to operational safety such as site restoration, non-radiological cleanup, redevelopment planning, etc., are subject to state and local oversight and are not preempted. We certainly understand and honor the preemption that we have on nuclear issues here and on radioactive issues, but we really think that as much local oversight relative to site restoration and other non-nuclear issues should be there. So just to look at the Pilgrim plant, roughly there are $900 million in the current trust fund. We think right now that the estimated costs are about $1.4 billion. I have actually filed a piece of legislation in Massachusetts that will require the operator put another $25 million a year into that fund to bridge that gap, because right now it looks like we're going to be about $500 million short. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, there you see, based on certain assumptions made relative to the growth of the fund, certain return rates, and you see there anywhere from 3.5 to 5% along the bottom axis, and the increase or escalation of the decommissioning cost along the other axis, that we could have a shortfall of anywhere on the low end of 4.4 billion, anywhere on the high end of 58.2 billion, and that concerns us greatly relative to the payment of this. Next slide, please. And the final slide just shows the widening gap over time, should we go out to the 60 years with the safe store option, of what the shortfall could be if we don't really manage the trust fund adequately and make sure that the reserves continue to be built up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the commissioners.
Thank you. Representative Dudley, welcome.
Good morning. Dwight Dudley here, State Representative from Florida. Just to clarify, I am not representing any official position of our state, other than speaking on behalf of consumers that have been hurt deeply by the process that's occurring in Florida with regard to Crystal River 3. I like very much Senator Wolf's presentation. I think he covered all my points, but I'll go forward. First slide. We'll whip past the history of Crystal River 3, because you all know so much more about that than anyone. But in 2009, let's see, go to the shutdown slide, please. In 2009, Crystal River 3 was taken offline so that 2 of its steam generators could be upgraded. In an attempt to save $15 million, the utility decided to perform the upgrades themselves. They botched it. 3 basketball court-sized delaminations of the containment building occurred. 34 other plants that successfully replaced steam generators. They had used, I guess, Sergeant Lundy and Bechtel, but, I guess a case of beer and a wild weekend uprating is not a good idea. Cost to ratepayers, $1.3 billion for repairs, operations, maintenance, and construction. We're going to cost to ratepayers slide. $450 million for upgrades under Florida's nuclear cost recovery statute. As much as $300 million per year for replacement fuel, $1.5 billion for natural gas plant replacement generation lost by the closure of Crystal River 3. The community affected. The metro area surrounding Crystal River topped the nation in GDP lost in 2014. 400 plant workers lost their job. Duke Energy's tax bill dropped from $35 million to $13 million. A quarter of the county's general revenue fund disappeared. Dire consequences for the schools, safety, public services, and now there is in this beautiful area of Florida what they call the nuclear stigma is affecting the economy and having a real impact. Duke collected $100 million from the original failed upgrades to the plant's steam generators. In addition, they were able to keep 7% from a subsequent $100 million project to stabilize a broken containment wall. All these were granted by the PSC. They have a very close relationship with the industry, and cost $1.18 billion in 2013, $100 million for dry cast fuel storage site. Decommissioning fund had $780 million in it. Chris River 3 decommissioning fund held at $1.4 million in 2000. It rose to $580 million in 2007, dropped sharply to $417 million in 2018 during the financial crisis. The fund will grow to an estimated $5.9 billion by 2076. You know, we won't get to see that personally, but so with regard to decommissioning funds, we think more needs to be done to secure the public, require licensees to have adequate decommissioning funds upon closure, prohibit funds from being used for purposes other than cleanup of radiological contamination, as Senator Wolf referred to, like lobbying activities or any number of different other ways to spend money. We need to suggesting you proactively monitor the expenditures, ensure that the unexpended funds be released to ratepayers. We know that due to a GAO report, 27 out of the 104 decommissioning funds had a combined shortfall of $2.4 billion. The NRC's decommissioning funding formula may be outdated since it was last revised in 1988 and is based on two studies published in 1978 and 80 that used technology costs and other information available at that time. The exemption process has been used to undermine the financial viability of decommissioning funds. Energy, Vermont Yankee plant, intends to use funds to pay $600,000 in local taxes, legal and lobbying expenses, costs for fuel transfer, and guarding of high-level waste. Reports are only required once every 2 years, and the NRC seems to be concerned only with whether or not licensees are on track financially, or so it seems. There is no guarantee that ratepayers will be paid back unused monies, $5.9 billion versus $1.8 billion. So the big elephant in the room really is from most Floridians, and particularly those who live in and around the Chris River 3 plant, that this huge property and this area is stigmatized and can be held as it is for the next 60 years is not a good thing. And so I, as evident by my presentation, am not an expert in these matters. I'm just carrying forward the complaints of the people, by and large, that feel powerless in this matter, and that we go forward with greater consideration for the economies of these communities in the regulations that are applied to do better by the people, to assure that the monies are adequate to maybe decommission more quickly, and the like. So we have our host of issues with some of the plants in the state, and I know that this isn't the time for that, but I'll just touch on the issues down in Miami area, Turkey Point, recent findings of trillium in the Biscayne Bay. These are huge issues, and we believe that NRC needs to have a greater role, not a smaller role. That deregulation is a horrible idea if that's a great, a main impetus. That should be greatly reconsidered, and that we can do much better than we're doing today. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for your presentations. We'll start the questioning with Commissioner Savinicki.
Thank you all again for being here. I realize that you have a lot of other responsibilities, so I appreciate your time and your perspectives that you shared here today. I think that I heard an explicit acknowledgement from some of you that either the states you represent or the constituents that you represent will be submitting comments, or some of you will be submitting comments so that the public comment period does not close until Friday. I look forward to spending some time in detail with that. I know that we posed a lot of questions in the Federal Register notice, so I acknowledge that what we're discussing here today is really just some high-level perspectives, but also as I reflect on your presentations, the first thing I'm reminded of, having been to nearly every facility that was mentioned here today by any of you, including Humboldt Bay, Rancho Seco, and GE Vallecito, so I've been to a number of the decommissioning sites. I'm just reminded by listening to your presentations of really how intensively site-specific a lot of these issues are. The second thing I'm reminded of, or maybe have a greater appreciation for based on your presentations, is how your connection with these facilities, which we think of as just regulated entities, are both broad and deep. It's the people who work there, it's the communities around the plants, it is, of course, enduring legacy issues that, either representing the constituents nearby or state agencies. What we're talking about today and this proposed scope of this rulemaking is really just one narrow aspect. These are entities that operate or have operated in your communities and in your states, and you have other economic relationships with them, perhaps state permitting and other things that goes on. So that's the other thing that I'm reminded afresh of, how broad and deep all of your roles are when it regards these facilities. I was concerned that mentioning preemption today would be discourteous, and Senator Wolf helped me so much by just explicitly taking it head on, having two lawmakers at the table, and on this side of the table, three people who spent some aspects of their career working for lawmakers. I hope it's not remiss for me to mention that as a federal agency, we must and therefore will comply with state law. And under existing federal law, we do not have an unlimited ability to relinquish our regulatory authority over certain things. And I'm not suggesting that any of you were advocating for that. You certainly, in your other capacities, can advocate for federal law changes, but we have to operate within that. And I just don't want to set an expectation that there's an unlimited ability to modify this process. That being said, I think that there are a lot of areas, you've touched on many of them today, that do provide us opportunities to examine maybe issues of established commission policy. We can't change the law. You've heard our NRC staff talk about encouraging good practices. The other aspect of our complying with laws, that we don't have an unfettered ability to mandate everything we think is a good management practice. We have to have a sufficient justification for making things compulsory. So, but I think within that, and certainly as was responded to Commissioner Barron's question, our staff will engage in a very genuine look at this area. It hasn't been examined, and I made reference to our work in 2000, and as I was reading some of that stuff last night, I think of that as being so current. Well, that was 16 years ago. As the years go by, it's amazing how you're humbled by how fast it's going by. So I do look forward to continuing this engagement. Ms. Engelhardt, you mentioned your specific Wisconsin experiences where you had to handle a lot of the emergency preparedness issues on kind of an ad hoc basis. But I would compliment you, and I think the licensee, to the extent NRC contributed to that. I guess I'll give us a pat on the back as well. Because I think although that's not maybe the optimal way to address those, you seem to have been able to handle each of those reasonably. That being said, we don't want to continue to have to use ad hoc processes. As you heard from my comments with the NRC staff, if you were here, I don't want us to be in a place where we once again handle decommissionings through an imperfect process and we forego the benefits of things. I'm encouraging the staff to look creatively at scope and timing and pacing, what I'll call maybe sequencing of consideration of issues. as I listen to you, would just very much like some of the decommissionings you're talking about now to benefit from some of this. But, I'll just admit candidly to you, federal rulemaking is not a quick activity. And I think that would be a missed opportunity for all of us if we couldn't capture anything in the near term. I do also think that the staff, in examining the public comment record, will probably find things that don't require rulemaking. So I do encourage you to have your shared experiences and lessons learned, because there may be some of that we wouldn't require a change in regulation. They may be simply practices that we could improve our own processes, and so I know our staff will give a very sincere consideration of that. So with all of that, I would just say that you all have your own relationships with these entities. Is there anything you would say for what you're going through right now is a really key and principal lessons learned, not about the NRC process, but about your own or your state level processes? Is there anyone who just at a high level would reflect on, we wish we had this in place or we had done that better? And I think the other curious thing is we've all talked about having little notice of premature cessation of operation. It occurs to me, other than Oyster Creek, that may be more the norm than the exception. And so, I'm having just open to thoughts on, should we adjust our thinking on that? Maybe they'll all be kind of short notice. Anyone who would like to respond?
Commissioner, just for New Jersey, you spoke a little bit about preemption before, and we all fully understand that, but I think, at least on the operating side, what we've done a very good job working with the utility, and that relationship is key to be able to handle all the off-site issues that aren't necessarily preemption issues, but they're issues that the utility might not be required to do. But you need that conversation, you need that two-way street to be able to satisfy the community, but also stay back in the preemption side. The agreements that agencies have in place to to participate in inspections, to be at the table all the time, that's huge. The SLO program that allows us to have, the states to have information before the public does, to be able to sound off and say, yes, we're fully aware, we're on board with this. So those types of things are all very important.
And those are perfect examples when I referred to it as your own relationships with these, the employees, with the sites, being both broad and deep. Those are all good examples of that.
Absolutely.
If I could, and again, no one understands better than an airline person federal preemption. So I really get it, and actually.
So I should have counted on you to take that on. Thank you for opening the door.
I mean, really, it's needed in a lot of issues like this. What I would say the NRC might consider doing a better job of, or a more proactive job of, is playing the facilitator. Because even though you may not have regulatory or legal authority in certain areas, the fact is you are the regulating agency. So when you bring the stakeholders to the table, you do it in a different way. Whether you have the ability to actually influence the outcome on a certain issue, the mere fact that you're bringing us together is a lever point for the utilities. And they're not all willing to play ball like maybe the New Jersey experience. I can tell you that. It's different in Massachusetts. So I would ask that whether it's formal in the rules or whether you just do it informally, we're dealing with EPA, we're dealing with Massachusetts Environmental Protection Agency, as well as other state agencies, and very often NRC isn't at the table. So if you were willing to do that, I think it would actually make a difference.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment?
I will just comment that I believe Kiwani was the first of this new batch of shutdowns, and so everything was done at first on ad hoc basis, but I'd really like to compliment our Region 3 NRC liaisons. They did their best to answer our questions, and NRC headquarters. But I did feel that there was a need for maybe a decommissioning team that included the state and locals, NRC, FEMA, and plant representation to even, explain to us what the exemption process was. How did it work? At one point, FEMA made a phone call to me and said, the plant got their exemption. And I said, they did. That's strange. I guess I would have thought they would have called. And it was just one exemption out of many. So we didn't understand the process at all. So I guess what Senator Wolf was saying is what I'm getting at too, is that there needs to be more of a formalized process, a team that sits down together and maintains situational awareness and monitors the activities that are going on during the decommissioning process.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the importance of communication both ways is one of the key messages that should come out, and also that it's really important that the plant operator has that sense of community. You know, and looking at San Onofre, Edison has done a number of things voluntarily, which have certainly helped. But, you know, in terms of the engagement panel, in terms of continuing to do the monitoring and emergency planning, again, you've got in my state, each area has been different, but I think all of us need to adapt to the specific circumstances and try to communicate well in terms of understanding people's concerns and move forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tim.
Thank you. Commissioner Ostendorf.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I also benefit tremendously, as do my colleagues, from hearing your perspectives. And I know that some of these things are things we have some control over. Some of these are outside of our control. But it's good to air those, so that it's important for us as commissioners to have situational awareness of what things are on your plate and of your concerns, even if they may sometimes fall outside of our regulatory responsibilities. Like Commissioner Svinicki, I've been to many of your sites. I've been to Humboldt Bay, been to Songs twice since shutdown. I've been to Quaney. I was there in September 2013, had a long discussion with Quaney, then also with Point Beach about the relationship. Been to Crystal River, Pilgrim, Turkey Point, St. Lucie, Salem Hope Creek. And so I think the commission benefits by getting out and seeing these sites, talking to the community individuals, but also hearing more formally in this setting your concerns. I guess I'm going to start out with Senator Wolf's comment on the coordination. I'm going to kind of look at California here. I think we want to help be part of the solution on coordination and facilitation. But I look at just in the San Onofre community, the number of different local governmental entities involved in that is overwhelming to a certain extent. And so I can't remember the number. I've met with several of them on my 2 visits out there. And we need to be careful that we're not trying to pick winners or losers as far as who gets a seat at the table, who does not. Because that sometimes surfaces in these discussions with the NRC placed in a somewhat awkward position as to who is going to speak at a particular event. You know what I'm talking about, Dr. Weisenmuller. Miller, excuse me.
Exactly. I was going to say that. But the reality is for California, all of our citizens really want to be engaged. Yeah. And it's important to have an open process. Encourage them.
Absolutely. And it is for us, but pragmatically trying to actualize that, sometimes there's hurt feelings and groups left out because it's difficult to allow 50 different groups to be at the table for a particular meeting. And in particular in Southern California, sometimes there's a large number of different entities. So I think your comment is helpful. I know that our staff is very committed to the open meeting, open forum process to allow everybody's voices to be heard. And while from your perspectives we may sometimes fall short of the mark, it's not for lack of effort. I think it was my observation as a commissioner here.
Yeah, and I hope I didn't send the wrong message. The NRC staff in our region has been really responsive and has been at the table. I think what I'm saying is, and to echo the point, if there was a formal sort of mandate or structure that allowed that to happen in a more predictable and open way, I think our constituents would appreciate that. Because the staff is doing a great job there, but it's just, I don't think they're really clear the degree to which they should be engaging at all these levels.
Okay. I appreciate the spirit of your comment, and I agree that we need to be very sensitive to ensuring that the voices are heard. I'll just comment, even in preparation for this meeting and the attendees for this meeting, there are some challenges at different state levels as to who's going to represent an individual state.
Right. Sure.
That's just reality of the world we're in. So thank you for that comment. I think that's very helpful. Mr. Baldufa, let me talk to you about, I have a question I want to ask you about on your slide 4, please.
Sure.
And you made the comment, if I understood it correctly, that previously approved exemptions are likely to deviate from the final rule. And do you have anything in particular, any particular safety aspect in mind in that comment?
Oh, I think the focus on that's probably emergency planning, meaning that, our belief is that emergency planning shouldn't cease off-site shouldn't cease at the, say, 15 months, whatever roughly that time is from cessation operations. So let's say, for instance, that the new rule, the final rule, has some other requirement from the time period of that 15 months until all the fuels and dry casts. That would be a deviation. That would be the type of change. So you'd be in a situation where you have exemptions out there that were treated differently than going forward with the final rule. So those are the types of things. It'd be really any change. I mean, the whole point of the slide was try to say that it's the rule process to engage all the stakeholders. If the end game, the only thing it's done is codify exemptions that have been done in the past, I'm not sure what you gained other than,
So do you have a safety issue with exemptions that NRC has granted for the decommissioned sites so far? Maybe that's the better way of me asking the question.
Yes.
What's your safety concern?
Our belief is that regardless of the magnitude, if you can have an off-site release, whether it's below or above the EPA PAG level, we believe that's a safety concern. Now, let's take the assumption it's below the PAG level. We still think there should be some off-site capabilities in place and a dedicated off-site plan is much more effective than an all-hazards plan to protect those people. And we think that something needs to be in place at least until everything's in dry cast storage.
Is there a specific exemption that we have granted for the Kewanee, Songs, Crystal River, Vermont Yankee that you're alluding to, or is it more of a general concern you have?
It's our general understanding exemptions issued that they're no longer required to do off-site emergency planning. So it's not one specific piece of it. The whole program ceases to exist at a certain point. And we believe it's premature. We believe as long as it can go off-site, there should be something in place. We're not saying it has to remain unchanged. We realize that. But something should be changed.
Okay. I appreciate the specificity. Dr. Weisenmiller, you made a comment, if I heard you correctly, that the NRC should look at exemptions, and I believe you used the phrase in a more systematic fashion.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that, perhaps?
Well, again, I think the basic message is all these sites are different, and looking at what you're going through, and again, I was thinking particularly similar to some sort of tiered approach, that, once everything is off the site, obviously it's pretty straightforward. When things are moved into the cast, again, I think our level of concern goes down significantly, but in that period of time where stuff is still in spent fuel pools, going into the cast is where we still have some concerns, and we appreciate Edison's efforts to expedite the movement there. But I think in terms of, again, looking at cut and dry just when you stop operating, obviously it's a lot safer, but it will not be as safe as it will when it's all in the cast.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Bear.
Well, thank you again to all of you for being here. It's really not that often we have a commission meeting where we have stakeholders representing folks from coast to coast. It's a little bit like our Super Tuesday of commission meetings, so thanks. I want to start with what's really probably a pretty obvious question for a panel of state officials, which is what's the right role for state and local governments in the decommissioning process. As has been mentioned, there are a few days left in the comment period, but I've been looking through the comments we've received so far, and I saw that many of them suggest that NRC require the establishment of a community advisory panel with state and local representation for each plant entering decommissioning. Ms. Engelhardt and Senator Wolf made that suggestion today. Is that something you think we should consider requiring? And should a licensee be required to provide its post-shutdown decommissioning activities report to the community advisory panel for feedback prior to its submission to the NRC?
I think it's crucial. I appreciate the raising the issue. It's so industry driven in Florida, at least. I don't know what the experiences of all the other states would be, but community involvement, input, and so on is critical, and I think that should be greatly considered.
Please and absolutely.
Yes, everything that we do with the utility now is in tandem, and so it's just a matter of why stop at the announcement of their shutdown. There's still a lot of off-site concerns, a lot of community concerns, so I feel that they should continue that working relationship to get through that process as well.
Yeah, no, I think what I've found is, frankly, my citizens look to us for some degree of independent assessment information in this area. And so one way or another, we're part of the process. And so having a more formal role makes sense. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, talk about how each site has its own link hole. So obviously one of the complications for San Onofre is it's in the middle of a military base. Mm-hmm. And certainly under the lease agreement with the Marines there, it's supposed to be brought back to the condition it was beforehand. And so that's sort of another really significant player that somehow needs to be folded into this process is, what exactly does that lease mean in terms of what the Navy/Marines are going to require?
For New Jersey, I think that, regardless of how the final rule comes out, we would have a community advisory panel, just because of our active engagement and how our agencies operate. But our concern, and you'll see in our comments, is we ask for it to just be strongly encouraged, because our concern is one size doesn't fit all. Yeah. And so if you put a mandatory piece in there, it might work perfect for Florida, but not for New Jersey and not for New York or whatever it may be. Because as I think was spoken by some of the NRC staff earlier, each site is unique. The stakeholders are unique, everywhere from very strongly organized to not that much involvement. So you want to be able to craft it so it can work for every jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. What's your vision about, so there's the question of whether NRC should mandate the existence at all of such a community advisory panel. But putting that aside, what's your vision for how the composition of that panel should be determined? Who should determine the composition of that panel? And because I take your point, it's going to be different in every case.
I mean, in most states it's unique because you have different agencies. So in our state, it would be Department of Environmental Protection, State Police Office of Emergency Management, and then we pull together all the affected groups. So there'd be the county, the local responders, things like that. And also, we obviously have a very long track record with all the concerned stakeholder groups, and they would have a seat at the table also.
If I could, I would broaden that out a little bit, because there are going to be land use issues, there are job issues, and there are economic issues. So I think it's a great conversation. I'd like to think about it, maybe get back to you, because I think there's a process you could work through the state to get recommendations for appointees or positions that are appointed that would really facilitate a great outcome. We're all acknowledging that they all are individual and unique, but all individual and unique have a lot of themes that are in common that would suggest certain people would really fulfill that mission on the panel in a really meaningful way.
Okay. We'll get into this a little bit more in the next panel, but the nuclear industry has recommended that NRC proceed with a rulemaking focused just on the exemption piece. Under this approach, as I understand the proposal, NRC would not take a fresh look at all the other issues, including the appropriate role of state and local governments. I wanted to get your thoughts collectively, and I guess individually and then collectively. What do you think about that approach, the narrowly focused rulemaking just on exemptions?
I'll jump in. I think that's absurd. We have lessons learned from operating these plants and from decommissioning them. So I totally agree with Commissioner. I'm not going to try your last name because I'd insult you. But I totally agree that there's opportunity to expedite some of the proposed rules, to bifurcate and to expedite. But that should not be instead of taking a much more broad and deliberative approach to the bigger issues. If we do what you're suggesting and just focus on exemption, we're eliminating a lot of the lessons learned that could be applied in some really meaningful ways.
Other thoughts about the narrow versus broad?
I think historically we've failed in terms of not thinking a lot about the back end of the fuel/reactor cycle, and this is a good opportunity to do that. Certainly our plants were not sited with the perception that they would be interim waste storage facilities at these spots. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think if you don't include the stakeholder participation early on in the process and wait till later, it's a disservice, because I think one of the biggest issues that the local communities have is they don't have a role. They don't have a piece in the exemption process. They don't have a say what's going on. And whether it's simply just a community advisory panel type situation that allows them to voice their concern goes a long way towards getting them supportive of whatever's moving forward. And at a minimum, at least they know that their voice has been heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To do otherwise would seem undemocratic.
Okay. Thanks for your comments on that. So I take it we don't have any votes on this panel for the narrow rulemaking that just looks at exemptions. Okay. It's not democratic in quite that fashion where we vote by panel, but it's good to get a sense of where people are on things. NRC is specifically seeking comment on the question of when it's appropriate for the licensee to deactivate the Emergency Response Data System, or ERDS. Ms. Engelhardt, after Kiwani shut down, I should say Kiwani.
Either way is fine.
Okay, I appreciate that. Dominion voluntarily kept ERDS operational for the data points that were still relevant to the spent fuel pool. Do you think that was a good outcome, and is that something that NRC should consider requiring?
I think for us it gave us something to rely on, and we still felt like we had that capability. If something went wrong with the spent fuel pool, we still would have access to ERDS and could still perform a little bit of an independent assessment. So we feel that if something went wrong, it would be useful, would be beneficial, and as long as it's not cost prohibitive to the utility, we would like to maintain that capability. Yeah.
Do others have thoughts about ERDS and when the appropriate time to completely shut it down is?
Sure. I mean, for our comments were specific to, it really is the key piece of information offsite organizations use for response purposes. So obviously you're only looking at a few items there at that point, but we think it should exist to some degree until such times everything is in dry cask storage. Because without that, even though we have other ways, without that, that's one piece you're kind of flying blind at that point. So even if you don't expect that release to go off site necessarily, you still might have to make protective action recommendations, things like that, and that's a critical piece to have.
Could I respond to that?
Yeah.
Wearing my pilot hat for a minute. At Pilgrim, there is a wet storage facility that is holding over 3,000 spent fuel rod assemblies that was designed to hold 880. It is at the top of the building that was designed to have strong walls and a weaker roof so that a rapid discharge would go up instead of out. We should do nothing to diminish the emergency response until all of the fuel that can be safely moved from wet to dry storage. I can't emphasize that enough. I think the staff is understating the exposure of how this fuel is being stored, both to natural disaster, but also to some kind of other event. So I won't say it again if I said it emphatically enough that time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think just again, having the data is important. So there are, if something happens, it's a way of either reassuring the public it's not significant or dealing with it.
Thank you again for your thoughts, and I look forward to reading the written comments for those of you who are submitting them. Thanks.
Again, I want to thank the panel for your presentations. If you have a few questions, actually I'll start with Mr. Baldoff, and perhaps a more narrow question. I thought your comment with respect to the sort of the memorandum of understanding on inspection was interesting. I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at one of those. I'm presuming they may be more open-ended, but I don't know. You may have looked in terms of a particular type of termination, but it does seem to me that there's value in terms of the state. Excuse me, at the continued cooperation of the state during that phase. But I don't.
To be quite honest, we didn't look at the language. I'm not saying it does look like it stopped at that point. We just wanted to reinforce that the fact needs to go on. I mean, the other piece that needs to be understood too, the resident inspector leaves fairly early or fairly soon after the reactor ceases operation. So it's just another comfort level to know that even though the resident inspector isn't there, we do have staff that have the ability to be there and are still continue to participate in all activities.
Right, and obviously, when the residents go, we do continue to have inspection oversight of activities and then sort of ability to coordinate and all that. So I think that's a good, one of those little things. It's probably worth looking at on both of our ends in terms of that. And I take the point in your context, and I think Senator Wolf mentioned, and this comes from my own experience visiting one of the plants currently under decommissioning, because I think the interesting thing when I visited them last year is the Zion plant which was north of Chicago.